Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Irina Lights LLC and is in schus and merit of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, and Rabbi Yael HaKohen Kan Olav Hashalom. It's also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz, Le'erech Yomim V'Shonim Tevis, for long, healthy years. So we concluded chapter 12 of Tanya, the chapter about the Benoni. The first chapter is dedicated to the Benoni, which is the core essence of Sefer Shel Benonim. That was followed by that followed the chapter about the Rosha in chapter 11, and before that, chapter 10 about the Tzaddik. The Benoni is the paradox, and is the average person, meaning is midas kol adam v'acharel kol adam yimshach. This is what we are all capable of aspiring to. Because on one hand, the Benoni has a divine soul and animal soul that are actively in battle. But on the other hand, he exercises the control of moyach shalta lev, self-control that doesn't allow the animal soul to govern. It states his voice. There's a battle going on. But the divine soul governs and controls the person, the thought, speech, and action. And even the inadvertent thoughts, Seiruri Aveda, that may arise, as soon as he's aware of it, the Benoni, he pushes it aside and moves on and focuses on something else. But so his thought, speech, and action is entirely controlled by the divine soul. And yet the animal soul is active. That's the paradox. And that's something we can all aspire to, as we learned, that we can reach a place where in that moment we're like a Benoni, like we never did a sin and never will do one. In actuality, a paradigm shift. With that in mind, these two sides, and as we learned, both in Benoni Lamokim and Benoni L'Chavere, we now enter chapter 13. Chapter 13, the Alter Rebbe further develops these dual voices, and will also begin to answer the questions that he began asking in chapter 1 in the beginning of Tanya. So let's begin. Ubezeh Yuvan. With this, what we just learned in chapter 12 about the nature of the Benoni, we can understand Loshen Maimer Razal, the expression of our sages, which was actually cited in the first chapter, in chapter 1, Beinonim Zeh v'Zeh Sheftan. And here we'll see both the brilliant and simple way the Alter Rebbe explains the Maimer Chazal and gives us insight into the very personality and psychology of the human being. So again, the language is Beinonim Zeh v'Zeh Sheftan. That the case of the Benoni, as we said, the Benoni is not someone who has half mitzvahs and half averos, but rather it's a personality conflict. He's a Benoni because on one hand, he has a divine and animal soul, on the other hand, the divine soul is the one that dominates. And the expression is Zeh v'Zeh Sheftan. And the Alter Rebbe is going to be medayik on the word Sheftan. That Zeh v'Zeh, which means both the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, Pirush. Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara, he writes in the brackets. The impulse to good and the impulse to the negative is both of them sheftan. Now what does that mean? Because we said that only one has control. Yes, it's like two kings that are fighting over a city, but only one has control. And that's going to explain the word sheftan and not moishlan. They don't both rule, they're both like judges. And he's going to explain that in very precise detail. But before we continue, he says, Tiksiv, as it says, and the Gemara, this Gemara, Beinonim Zeh v'Zeh Sheftan, which is the Gemara in Bracha Samach Aleph Omid Beis, brings a pasuk. The Ksiv, a pasuk proof to this. For it says, Ki yamid limin evyin leishia misheftei nafshe. Sheftei nafshe. He, God, stands at the right side, or the right hand, limin evyin, of the poor person, of the pauper, leishia misheftei nafshe, to save him from those that guide his soul. Or those that, you can say, shefti nafshe, and we'll soon see. Guide is one way to translate it. You could also say those that, you don't say judge his soul, but those that state their opinion about and to his soul. And this is a pasuk in Tehillim, Kuf Tes, Lamed Aleph, 109:31. And that's what the Gemara learns from that, Zev Zeh Sheftam, from the word, Misheftei Nafshe. Now, Sheftei Nafshe is plural. Why does it say Sheftei? Because Zev Zeh Sheftam, because we're talking about two Sheftim, two judges, the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. And here's the diuk. V'lo ya'omrei Zev Zeh Meishlim Chaz v'Shalom. The Chazal don't say Meishlim, and the pasuk also doesn't say Meishlim. That it's ruled. Meishel means it's ruled by. It's governed by. So if it says Zev Zeh Meishel, means two forces are control him. A Meishel v'Shelet. Which would mean that the Yetzer Hara also has direct control over him. Chaz v'Shalom, God forbid. Why is it God forbid? Because we learned earlier by the Benoni it's not the case, as he's going to explain shortly. Ki kishiyesh eza shlita mamshala liyetzer hara be'ir ktana. For if the Yetzer Hara has any control and dominance over the small city, which is what the guf, iktana zeh guf, and the teshvei and the citizens of the small city are the faculties. Afil lefisha kala, even for a short while, nikra rasha be'eser shah. Then that person is classified and he's called a Rasha at that time, and not a Benoni, as he explained in the previous chapter. He actually said that very language. He said. Because if he does a beratzin, even a thought, and definitely speech and action, then he's called a Rasha. So if it would say Meishlim, then that's not appropriate to the Benoni. Because that means there are two forces that are governing. Like we spoke, think of two opposition parties. One can govern, then the other one governs. Or they both have a say. We learned that by the Benoni, they both have a say, but only one governs. An opposition party can state its voice. But as we're going to learn, as we're learning now, but it's like a shefet, like a judge, not like a moishel. When judges state something, they don't control what will be. If it was one judge and everything is determined by him, so he controls and he defines what the law is. But here we're talking about two different judges. So it's interesting that now in the moshel that he used in chapter 9 of two kings that are battling, he's now introducing the concept of two judges that are also battling. Their battle is different opinions. The Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara have very different ways of looking at things. But it's not Meishel. The kings want the control. The animal soul wants control, but it doesn't. So that's why it's called Shefet. Now, if the Benoni would give in, then he wouldn't be a Benoni, then he'd be a Rasha. Because then the Yetzer Hara is governing, is ruling, is dominating. And we know that the Yetzer Hara does not control, does not rule, but it does have a voice like a Shefet. And now he continues the Alter Rebbe to explain exactly that. So how does it work? He doesn't say Zev Zeh Meishlim Chaz v'Shalom, כי כשיש איזה שליט במשל יצר הרע בעיר קטנה, אפילו לפי שקטל, נקרא רשע בעץ אישה. But you could say he's a shefet. Opinion he states. And the Benoni does not accept that opinion. As we shall continue to learn now. Ella, here's how it works by the Benoni. Ella yetzer hara eina ra kal derech moshel kamei shefet v'dayim. The fact is rather that the yetzer hara is not a controller, is not a meshel v'shelet. He's not controlling and ruling. He's not a ruler. He's, for example, only kamei shefet v'dayin. He's merely, for example, like a judge, like a magistrate, or a judge, shefet v'dayin. It's two words, but they both have the same idea. And what does a shefet v'dayin? What does a shefet v'dayin do? What does a judge do? Ha'omer daite b'mishpat. He states his legal opinion in judgment. V'afal pikein yochel liyash lo yeh psak halacha kach l'maaseh. And though he states his opinion, he's not a ruler. He doesn't necessarily have to follow what he says. That the bottom line is it may not become the final legal ruling. Why? Like you have a bezdin. So one shefet, one judge states his opinion, but it's not necessarily the ruling that way, because then there's the other judge, the other magistrate, the other magistrate or judge, who dissents, disagrees with him. So what do? You have now two voices, different voices. That's why Bezdin is made of three. A third judge comes to resolve and to rule that the majority will rule between them. And we know the rule is that the law follows the words of the reconciliatory view, the reconciliatory view, machriya. Like we say every morning in davening, Shnei ksuvim hamakishim zeh zeh. You have two verses that contradict one another. Uba kosav hashlishi machriya beineim. And the third verse comes and reconciles between them. The halach is kedivri machriya. As the Gemara says in Shabbos, Lametez Beis 39b. So if we would say Moshel, it would incorrectly describe the situation. We're talking about a Benoni. Moshel means rule. So it says Shefet, because the two Sheftim are stating their opinion. Like we learned in chapter 12, the Nefesh Abamis absolutely states his opinion. Yes, during davening it's subdued or completely silenced. States its opinion. But the Benoni does not allow it to affect him in thought, speech, and action. Like we learned before about the king. The other king, the opposing king, is there and dissents and says otherwise. But there's also the Nefesh Alakis that's stating its opinion. So now that we have this example of the judges, here comes an interesting scenario. How do you determine who's the third judge here? How do you resolve it? So the Alter Rebbe continues that who's the Divrei Machriya, who's the third judge? It says, Hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Actually, 1 second, I skipped a few lines. That's the mashal. One judge says its opinion, the second judge says its opinion. You need to be machriya b'neihem. Kach hayetzer hara In a similar way, the Yetzer Hara, he states his opinion. What is the opinion about self-interest, the animal soul's interests? And that opinion is stated in the heart's left chamber, as we learned in chapter 9. It's not just an emotional impulse, but from the heart, it rises to the brain. And he contemplates on it, thinks about it. Umiyad. And immediately there's another voice. Umiyad. And immediately it's opposed by the second judge, which is the divine soul that resides in the brain, in the mind. And from there, like we learned, Hamispashit b'chola yemoni shebelev, Mekayim mishkan hayetzer tov. From there it spreads to the heart's right side, the place where the Yetzer Tov resides and rests. So there you have the two judges. The Yetzer Hara is the first judge that states its opinion. But immediately there's the second judge of the Nefesh Elikis, of the Yetzer Tov, that states its opinion. So you have two opinions now. And none of them are Moshel. They're Shefet, they're Sheftim, judges, magistrates. And how is it resolved? Like he said, V'alocha kedivrei machriya. And the halacha, and the ruling, the law will follow the words of the third, the reconciler, Hamachriya. And who is that in this, in the Nimshal, in the moral? Hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is referring to the Eibishter, to God. Hu HaEzrei LaYetzer Tov. He's the one that assists Ezrei to the Yetzer Tov, to the second judge. And that's the halach, and that's why the Yetzer Tov, Nefesh Elikis, will prevail. Kamaimer Azal, Abasenu Zechreim Levracha, as the sages taught us, Il Moleh Kadosh Baruch Hu Ezrei Ein Yachalei. Were it not for God, Kadosh Baruch Hu, who assists us, he could not overcome, the person could not overcome the Yetzer Hara. As the Gemara says in Kedushin Lamed Beis, 30b. As he explains, how does this manifest, this power? Va'ezid, this strength, this power, this assistance that the third judge is siding with the second judge, with the divine soul, with the Yetzer Tov, ha'ara shemeir er Hashem al nefesh elikis. This assistance is a glimmer of God's light shining upon the divine soul. Liyas le yisrein v'shlita al sichlus achsil, enabling the person to have the advantage over the yisrein and the control over the stupidity and the folly of the fool. Hachsil v'yetzer hara, the Yetzer Hara, like we learned in chapter 12, ki yisna er min hacheshech, like the advantage of light over darkness, keniskali il, as was mentioned before in chapter 12. So this needs explanation. Because before in chapter 12, he made no reference to God's help. There he said that in our natural inherent ability is moich shal talav. And the Benoni exercises it. The Rasha doesn't exercise it, but if you exercise your moich, it has natural control over the impulses and the folly of the heart, meaning of the Yetzer Hara, of the animal soul. Like the natural dominance of light over darkness. There's no mention. No mention of God's, of the third judge. And here he's introducing the third judge. So on the most ostensible level, being that he doesn't bring the words Me'ech Shal Talev here, because then it's the other way around. Here, he brings that you have the third judge, but he does bring the second half of the idea of the natural dominance of light over darkness. He doesn't say it natural here, but he does say Liyis lo yisrin v'shlita. So on a very ostensible level, you can explain that Gufa, who created the situation that Me'ech Shal Talev? We didn't create that. We're born that way. That's what he said in chapter 12. That's the nature of the person. From Zohar Pasha Pinchas. What was the lashon that he used there? Just to spell it out exactly. He said, it's the very nature. And how we're formed at birth. So who made it that way? That's the Eibishter made it that way. So on a very basic level, you could say that is God's light that shines on Nefesh Elikis, Liyis lo Yisrein, to give it the power to actually dominate, like light over darkness. The same thing with light over darkness. Who made that light naturally dispels darkness? It's not a human effort. It's not a human creation. That's the nature of it. So that would be the ostensible way to explain. So Moyach Shal Talev, whole gufa that we have Moyach Shal Talev, which naturally controls, is because there's a third judge that is supporting the Moyach Shal Talev. However, there's one condition. You need to activate your Moyach. Because here comes another klotz kasha. If this is indeed the case, that you have the Shefet, the Yetzer Hara says its opinion, and then you have the opposing opinion of the divine soul, the Yetzer Tov. And we learned that God will always yamed liman even the heshia meshefti nafshe. That you have God, the third judge, will always side with the divine soul. So why is it that we do Averis? Answer is, if we don't allow the divine soul to speak. You know, the kangaroo court of a communist court, there's only a prosecutor. The prosecutor states the case, and they declare the person guilty without ever hearing a defense. This is the power of the Yetzer Hara. The impulses of the Yetzer Hara are so powerful. What they do is, they control you, and you make a move without ever allowing the reflective mind to weigh in. That's how people fall. The Benoni, however, just doesn't do that. He activates his mind and says, no. The Yetzer Hara made a very good case. It's tempting me with something. There's a hirur, inadvertent thought. But the Benoni exercises something, an inherent power that he has. The faculty of Me'ech Shal Talev. And as soon as he does that, now we have two voices. So then, what's activated is triggered is Hashem, the third judge, siding with him, what he calls the Eir Havai, that's Meir al Nefesh Elikis. But if you didn't activate it, if you didn't have the second judge state his opinion, the third judge could never say anything, because you'd right away follow the first judge. And that would be over. See, I think in the name of the Razah, Rab Zalman, the brother of the Rebbe Rashab, he said that anytime you have an impulse for something, wait. I think he said 18 hours. Don't act on it right away. In other words, don't allow the impulse to take over, because most mistakes, if not all, happen at the spur of the moment. You get consumed with something, and you become completely irrational. Like we learned in chapter 12. Person doesn't sin unless it's a moment of folly. The Ruach Shtus has taken over. And many of us make that mistake. Think of it like just to use an example. You have some con artist calls you or meets you and is selling you some garbage, some product. But they're excellent at emotional manipulation. And anytime you hesitate and say, let me think about it, let me consult. No, it will expire. The deal expires in 10 seconds, in 10 minutes. Why? Because they want you to act impulsively. Not allowing you enough time to reflect. Because if you reflected, you'd probably discover you don't need this. That's what manipulation does. Same thing, the Yetzer Hara wants you to act immediately. It knows that time is not on its side. Because the more time you have to reflect, the more you say, 1 second, maybe not so smart. What's happening? You're letting your moyach shalta alev take over. The second judge is speaking, and the second judge is empowered then by the third one. So one way you can explain it is saying that the third judge in Lamaila works this way, that when you activate your moyach, who give you the power to have a moyach, that comes from the third judge. But the truth is, it's not sufficient. Because in the mashal, it sounds more like the divine soul states its opinion. Then comes the third opinion of the judge. So the Rebbe in his comments on Tanya explains this idea that in chapter 12, remember he's talking after davening. Since during davening, a person has the shas mechin the godless, he has that additional power that empowers him for the divine soul to come alive in its mind and in its emotions, to passionately connect to God. So even though after davening that subsides, but there's a reshim that remains. And that's why Me'ach Shal Talev is so powerful there. Here he's not talking about after davening. So here the emphasis is more on how the Eibishter is helping him. In other words, to put it in different words, yes, when the moyach is completely clear what it needs to do, it will naturally dominate over the animal soul, but it's not always clear. Because you can have the opinion of the animal soul, then the divine soul speaks, but being that we're regular human beings, we don't always have it clear. There are times it's very clear that it was a con artist. It's very clear that it's manipulation, but there are times that a case could be made. The Yetzer Hara, then comes the divine soul speaking, but the person's mind is not 100% clear. So even though naturally moyach shal ta'alev, but if your mind is not 100% sure the moyach shal ta'alev, you're not sure what to do. Comes the third judge, and that tips the scale toward the divine soul dominating in the Benoni. So all of this comes to explain that we have now an additional resource. In addition to what we learned in chapter 12 about Mo'ech Shal Ta'alev, the natural self-control. In addition to davening, that gives us also power. And that power spills over even though there's no reshim, he says, at all, but still there's something that affects him. We have also the Ava Mesuteres, the natural love that a person has to God that's concealed. And now we have the Eibishter, Kosh Baruch HaEzrei, and in both ways. He created us with that power of Me'ech Shal Ta'alev. And he comes also to weigh in on the condition that you are also weighing in, meaning the divine soul is allowed to speak. You didn't just act impulsively on the whims of the animal soul. All that adds up to the power of Yisin Shlita al Sichus Achsil v'Yetzar Kisir min Hashechesher Kanal. And that's why by the Benoni, the divine soul dominates. It's 2 against 1. And the halacha is Kedivrei HaMachriya, the third opinion, which is Hashem that sides with the divine soul. And that's why it says Moishel, not Shelet. That's why it says Shefet and not Moishel. Because it doesn't control, it doesn't rule. It's a judge that states its opinion. Think of how eloquent Alter Rebbe explains this concept. However, as we're going to continue to learn, the Benoni is still a Benoni. He hasn't eliminated the animal soul. It's still a Shefet. It states its opinion, and strongly. And we'll continue that next week. Everyone have a good tavach. TanyaApplied.com. You can find this and all the previous programs. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.